deep in the remote, sun-scorched hill country of central Texas, in a region where families lived miles apart, and the nearest semblance of law was a grueling 3-day ride away. A traveling physician named Dr. Samuel Hayes documented something in his personal journal that would become a macabre shadow, haunting him until his death 30 years later. The year was 1854. Between the humid, unsettling months of March and August, Dr. Hayes was called not once, but repeatedly to an isolated, almost forgotten homestead. There he found 7 young women, all sisters, ranging in age from just 15 to 28, and all of them in a horrifying, unnatural synchronicity were expecting children. The family patriarch, a gaunt and silent man, insisted it was God's divine will, a blessing on his house. The county sheriff, when he finally learned of the situation, found his investigation crippled. Key records had been deliberately destroyed. Witnesses were too terrified to speak, or perhaps too deeply entrenched in the frontier code of silence. For decades, the official explanation for this disturbing anomaly remained a private family matter. But the truth, buried in courthouse documents that miraculously survived a suspicious fire in 1867, reveals a nightmare. It is a cold case from the darkest corners of the American frontier, a story that challenges everything we understand about justice, silence, and the horrifying capacity for survival in a land without law. This is the story of the Hargrove family and the forbidden secret that festered on their isolated ranch in Blanco County. Before we continue with the story of the Hargrove family and what really happened on that isolated ranch in Blanco County, I want to ask you something important. This channel is dedicated to unearthing the most disturbing and forbidden histories that have been deliberately hidden for generations. If you believe these macabre stories need to be told, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Your engagement helps us uncover more forgotten cold cases just like this one. Now, let's discover what Dr. Hayes found when he arrived at the Hargrove Ranch on that humid March morning in 1854. What the doctor witnessed that day would set in motion an investigation that exposed not just one family's terrible secret, but the dangerous, oppressive isolation that allowed such horrors to remain hidden in the vast, untamed Texas frontier. Blanco County in 1854 was barely civilized by any measure. Texas had been a state for less than a single decade, and much of the central hill country remained a forbidding patchwork of scattered homesteads. Each family was an island, carving out a meager survival from the unforgiving limestone soil and the endless, whispering prairie. The county seat, Johnson City, wouldn't even be founded for another quarter century. Families existed in a state of profound, almost unimaginable isolation. The nearest neighbor might be 5 or even 10 miles away, accessible only by rough, treacherous trails that became impassable mud pits during the frequent rains. The Hargrove family had settled their ranch in 1847, claiming nearly 800 acres of harsh, unforgiving land along a bend in the Pedernales River. Josiah Hargrove, the patriarch, had come to Texas from Tennessee with his wife, Martha, and their already growing brood of daughters. By all accounts, he was a stern, unyielding man, deeply and darkly religious in the manner common to isolated frontier families. He was fiercely, almost violently, protective of what he called family privacy, a phrase that, in retrospect, sounds more like a threat than a principle. His nearest neighbors, the Drummond family, lived 6 agonizing miles to the east and saw the Hargroves perhaps twice a year at most, usually at a distance. Martha Hargrove, the mother, had died in childbirth in 1849. She was delivering her 8th daughter, an infant who survived only 3 days, as if rejecting the dark fate of the household she had been born into. This tragedy, which might have broken another family, only seemed to harden Josiah. It left him alone, the sole authority to raise his 7 surviving girls. The silence of the ranch deepened, the isolation becoming a tangible wall. The loss of his wife seemed to extinguish the last flickering ember of outside connection, plunging the family into a self-contained world ruled by one man's iron will. This event was the catalyst, the moment the Hargrove Ranch truly vanished from the world. By 1854, the daughters were a silent, spectral presence on the ranch. There was Ruth, the eldest, at 28, who had taken on her mother's duties with a quiet, unsettling resignation. Then came Naomi, 26, Judith, 23, Esther, 21, Deborah, 19, Mary, 17, and finally Sarah, just 15 years old. The family rarely, if ever, came to town. When they did, it was Josiah alone. Solitary, gaunt figure purchasing bulk supplies of flour, salt, and ammunition with the few dollars earned from selling cattle. The daughters were never seen. They had become phantoms, legends whispered about by the few families who lived within a 20-mile radius. Those who encountered Josiah in Fredericksburg described him as a tall, skeletal man with piercing, cold eyes and a manner of speaking that made even simple conversation feel like a dark sermon. He quoted scripture constantly, judgmentally, and seemed to view the world beyond his property lines with a deep, paranoid suspicion. The righteous need not explain themselves to the unrighteous, he once told a merchant in Fredericksburg who had innocently asked about his family's well-being. The statement was a slammed door, a warning. The Hargrove family was not to be questioned. Their world was forbidden territory, and Josiah was its sole, unassailable gatekeeper, enforcing a law that came not from Austin, but from his own twisted interpretation of the divine. The isolation of the Hargrove Ranch was extreme, even by the brutal standards of the Texas frontier. The property lay at the very end of a winding wagon trail that snaked through dense thickets of cedar and live oak. It required crossing 3 separate creek beds that flooded regularly, turning the trail into a raging, impassable barrier. During the winter months, the ranch could be completely cut off from the nearest semblance of civilization for weeks, even months, at a time. There was no school within 20 miles, no church closer than the small Lutheran congregation in Fredericksburg, a 30-mile journey that was considered too dangerous and frivolous to make. The Hargrove daughters grew up knowing almost nothing of the world beyond their father's 800 acres. Dr. Samuel Hayes, in contrast, was a man of the world. He had established his practice in Fredericksburg in 1852, one of only 3 physicians serving an area of several hundred square miles. At 42, he was an educated man, trained in Philadelphia before the romantic lure of the frontier brought him west. His journal, preserved by his descendants and now held in the Texas State Archives, provides the only detailed, horrifying account of what he found at the Hargrove Ranch. The summons that would forever change his life came on March 12, 1854. A young Mexican ranch hand named Diego Fuentes arrived at Dr. Hayes's office just after dawn, his horse lathered and shaking from a hard, desperate ride. Diego Fuentes carried a note, written in a careful, surprisingly educated hand. Dr. Hayes, your services required urgently. Medical matter of a delicate nature. Josiah Hargrove, Pedernales Ranch. The note included rough, almost cryptic directions and a promise of generous payment. Dr. Hayes, accustomed to the peculiarities of his isolated patients, gathered his medical bag and rode out that same morning. The journey took nearly 7 hours, the trail exactly as difficult as frontier residents described. As he approached the Hargrove property, Hayes noted in his journal the increasing, suffocating sense of isolation. "Past no dwelling for the final 3 hours," he wrote. "The land here is beautiful but oppressive in its emptiness. One could scream for days and never be heard." The ranch itself was more substantial than Hayes expected. The main house was a sturdy limestone structure, 2 stories with a wide porch, surrounded by several outbuildings. But something struck Hayes as profoundly wrong immediately. Windows shuttered despite the warm day, his journal reads. No sound of voices or activity, though it was mid-afternoon. An eerie silence that made my horse nervous. Josiah Hargrove met him at the door. His first words set the tone for the macabre nightmare that was about to unfold. "You've taken a sacred oath, Dr. Hayes," Josiah said, his voice low and intense. What you see here remains private. God's business is not the world's business." Hayes agreed, assuming he was there for a difficult childbirth, or perhaps a female ailment that frontier modesty demanded be kept confidential. Nothing could have prepared him for what he found inside. The interior of the house was dim, plunged into an artificial twilight. Every shutter was closed and barred against the daylight. As Dr. Hayes's eyes struggled to adjust, he noticed details that deeply troubled him. The house was immaculately, almost obsessively clean but unnaturally quiet. There was no sound of conversation, no bustle of daily life, only the sound of his own boots on the stone floor. Josiah led him upstairs to a large, cavernous room that had clearly been converted into a communal sleeping area. 7 narrow beds lined the walls, and in each bed lay a young woman. "My daughters," Josiah said simply, his voice devoid of any emotion. "All are with child. You will examine them and ensure they are healthy." Hayes stood frozen, his medical training warring with the sheer horrifying impossibility of what he was seeing. 7 sisters, all visibly pregnant, all in various stages, but each clearly several months along. The implications were immediate, grotesque, and impossible to ignore. Yet Josiah's manner suggested this was entirely ordinary, a simple fact of life. The doctor, swallowing his revulsion, began to examine each daughter in turn. His journal entries from that afternoon reflect his growing horror and confusion. Ruth, the eldest, was perhaps 6 months along, her expression one of calm, chilling resignation. Naomi, 5 months, showed clear signs of malnutrition. Judith and Esther, both approximately 4 months pregnant, seemed utterly exhausted, their eyes hollow. The 3 youngest daughters, Deborah, Mary, and Sarah, were in the earlier stages of pregnancy, between 2 and 3 months. It was these youngest girls who most concerned Dr. Hayes. Sarah, barely 15 years old, would not meet his eyes during the entire examination. She stared at the wall, her small body trembling almost imperceptibly. But what struck Hayes most profoundly was the daughters' collective behavior. They did not speak unless Josiah gave them explicit, non-verbal permission. They answered Hayes's medical questions with single, whispered words. They showed no surprise at their shared condition, no sign that anything unusual or horrifying was occurring. It was as if they had been trained, conditioned over years, to accept this waking nightmare as their unchangeable reality. "I have never in my life seen such complete submission," Hayes wrote in his journal later that night, his hand shaking. "Such an absolute, terrifying absence of individual will." During the examinations, Hayes tried to ask careful, probing questions. Who was the father? Where were their husbands? The daughters would only look to Josiah, who stood in the doorway like a sentinel. His response was chilling in its simplicity. "The Lord provides," Josiah stated, his voice flat. "These children are blessings. You need concern yourself only with their physical health, doctor." Hayes, his mind reeling with the obvious, unspoken question he could not bring himself to ask directly, provided what care he could. He recommended rest, a proper diet, and prenatal herbs, but his assessment was that their emotional distress was a far greater threat than any physical ailment. As Dr. Hayes prepared to leave, his bag feeling heavier than when he arrived, Josiah Hargrove walked him to his horse. The conversation that followed, recorded verbatim in Hayes's journal, reveals the patriarch's disturbing, impenetrable worldview. "You may think you understand what you've seen today, doctor," Josiah said, his piercing eyes fixed on Hayes. "But you are a man of the world, tainted by modern, corrupt ideas. I live by older laws, biblical laws. My daughters are my responsibility, given to me by God. What happens in my house is between me and the Almighty." Hayes rode away as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, his thoughts in a state of turmoil. Texas law in 1854 was a crude, unfinished thing, especially concerning matters of family governance. A father's authority over his household was considered nearly absolute, sacred, especially in these remote areas where legal oversight was a distant fantasy. But what Hayes suspected, what he couldn't quite bring himself to fully acknowledge, seemed to transcend even the loosest, most primitive interpretation of parental authority. This was not family governance. It was a macabre, forbidden kingdom. That night, back in the relative civilization of Fredericksburg, Hayes debated with himself about what action, if any, he could possibly take. His physician's oath demanded confidentiality. The unwritten frontier code demanded non-interference in another man's family matters. Yet surely what he had witnessed was a crime against God and nature, demanding some response. Dr. Hayes decided to confide in Father Klaus Brandt, the Lutheran minister in Fredericksburg, a man known for his quiet wisdom. He described what he had seen at the Hargrove Ranch, initially withholding the family's name, speaking only of the delicate and disturbing medical situation. Father Brandt's response was cautious but deeply troubled. "In the old country in Germany," the minister said slowly, "we would call the authorities immediately. We would have the magistrate investigate. But here, Dr. Hayes, you know as well as I that the law barely reaches these remote homesteads, and without direct testimony from the daughters themselves, what can truly be proven? If they claim the father of their children is, say, a traveling worker or multiple workers, who will contradict them? Their father." The two men discussed the horrifying situation for hours, ultimately deciding that Hayes had a moral, if not a clear legal, obligation to report the matter. The only authority available was Sheriff William Prescott, the county's elected lawman who operated out of a small, dusty office in Fredericksburg. But Prescott, when approached the next day, proved to be less than enthusiastic about investigating one of the county's most isolated and notoriously private citizens. He listened to Hayes's account, his expression hardening. "Doc, you're new to Texas," Sheriff Prescott said, leaning back in his chair and lacing his fingers behind his head. "Out here, a man's home is his castle. That ain't just a saying, it's the way we survive. Unless one of those girls comes to me directly in my office and makes a formal, sworn accusation, I got no cause to ride out there. Josiah Hargrove is a citizen in good standing. He pays his taxes. He causes no trouble if his daughters are pregnant. Oh, that's unfortunate, maybe even sinful, but it's not criminal unless someone files a complaint." Hayes, frustrated, pressed the issue. "Sheriff, surely the circumstances. 7 sisters all at once with no husband. Surely that suggests—" "It suggests a lot of things, Doctor," Prescott interrupted, his voice firm. "But suggestion ain't evidence. It ain't grounds for a warrant. You bring me a sworn statement from one of those girls or a witness to an actual crime and I'll act. Until then, my hands are tied." It was a response that reflected the harsh, unfeeling reality of frontier justice. Without a formal complaint, without witnesses willing to testify against the head of their own household, the law was essentially powerless. The very isolation that made the Hargrove Ranch a haven for its dark, forbidden secrets also made it nearly impossible to pierce those secrets with any legal action. Dr. Hayes left the sheriff's office feeling defeated and deeply, profoundly troubled. Dr. Hayes would soon learn, however, that his visit to the Hargrove Ranch had set events in motion that neither he nor Josiah Hargrove could control. In the weeks following that first disturbing examination, whispers began to spread through the scattered, isolated community of Central Texas. Hayes had maintained his medical confidentiality by not revealing the family's name to most people. But in a region where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were a valuable currency, it didn't take long for rampant speculation to focus on the Hargroves. The family's long, self-imposed isolation, their rare and unsettling appearances in town, and Josiah's notorious, fanatical peculiarity made them an obvious subject of macabre rumor. The truth, it seemed, was too horrifying for most to even consider, so they invented other, only slightly less disturbing, theories. Had the girls been consorting with local Comanche tribes? Had a band of outlaws taken up residence at the ranch? But the first crack in Josiah's wall of silence came from a completely unexpected source. It came from Diego Fuentes, the very same ranch hand who had summoned Dr. Hayes in the first place. Fuentes, it turned out, was not actually employed by Josiah Hargrove. He worked for the neighboring Drummond family, 6 miles away. He had been sent to fetch the doctor by someone else, someone who had paid him generously and sworn him to absolute secrecy about her true identity. In late April, nearly 6 weeks after Dr. Hayes's initial visit, Diego Fuentes appeared at the doctor's office once again. This time he was not in a hurry but seemed nervous, almost furtive. "I was paid to give this to you," Fuentes explained, handing Hayes a folded, sealed letter. "I was told to wait 1 month after I fetched you. Then deliver this. The lady said you would understand who it was from." The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was the same careful, educated script as the summons note. It was shaky, however, suggesting it had been composed in great haste or under terrible stress. "Dr. Hayes," the letter began, "if you are reading this, I have succeeded in bringing you here, and you have seen what no outsider has witnessed. I am the eldest. I write this in secret, knowing that discovery would mean punishment. We are not free to speak. He watches, always. But I will tell you this so that you know you are not imagining the horror. We have no husbands, we have no suitors, we have only him, and the isolation he has created." The letter was a desperate, terrifying confirmation of Hayes's worst fears. It was a cry for help from a prison that had no bars, a cold case unfolding in real time. The letter from RH continued, its contents growing more desperate with each line. "I do not ask you to understand our submission, only to know that what you suspect is true. My sisters and I are prisoners. We are not held by lock and chain, but by circumstance, by distance, by the laws that make us his legal property. If you are a man of conscience, you will find a way to help us. But know that we cannot help ourselves. We have nowhere to go. We have no one to turn to." And he has made certain, over many years, that we understand that speaking against him would mean our utter destruction. The letter was signed only with the initials RH. Ruth Hargrove, the eldest daughter, the one who had seemed so calm, so resigned. It was a chilling realization. Her calmness was not acceptance, but a mask, worn to survive. Dr. Hayes read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. Ruth had managed to communicate the forbidden truth while simultaneously explaining, with heartbreaking clarity, why that truth would be nearly impossible to act upon. She and her sisters were trapped not by physical restraints, but by the invisible, unbreakable bonds of isolation, total economic dependence, and the brutal legal reality that gave their father almost unlimited, God-like authority over them. They were, in every sense that mattered, his property. The doctor, now armed with a physical, if unsigned, piece of evidence, immediately took the letter back to Sheriff Prescott. He hoped this desperate cry for help would finally spur the lawmen into action. But the sheriff's response was, once again, predictably and maddeningly cautious. "This letter ain't signed, Doc," Prescott said, turning it over in his hands. "And even if it was, it don't constitute a formal complaint. It's just, well, it's suggestions and implications." "I can't arrest a man for implications." "Sheriff, this is clearly a cry for help," Hayes insisted, his voice rising. "Maybe so," Prescott acknowledged, his tone softening slightly. "But from a legal standpoint, I got nothing to work with. Those daughters are legally under their father's authority. They ain't married, so they got no husbands to advocate for them. And this letter, heartbreaking as it may be, don't name any specific crime. It's vague." Texas law in 1854 offered virtually no protections for women in such circumstances. Daughters were considered chattel, under their father's absolute authority until marriage, at which point that authority was simply transferred to a husband. The concept of domestic crimes, especially those of such a dark and disturbing nature, being subject to public prosecution, was still decades away from common acceptance. The very crime that Hayes and Ruth Hargrove were alluding to was almost never prosecuted, especially when it occurred within families and in such isolated, hidden circumstances. Hayes refused to let the matter drop. Frustrated by the law, he turned to history. He began making discreet inquiries among the few long-time residents of the area, people who might remember the Hargrove family before they had vanished behind their self-imposed wall. What he learned painted a disturbing picture of progressive, deliberate isolation and terrifying control. A merchant named Herman Fisher, who had been in Fredericksburg since 1846, remembered the early days of the Hargrove family's arrival. When they first came, Fisher recalled, stoking his pipe, Martha Hargrove, the wife, would sometimes come to town with him. She was a quiet woman, very proper, but you could see the strain in her face even then. After each new daughter was born, she became more withdrawn. By the time of her death in '49, she hadn't been to town in more than a year. Fisher also remembered something else, a specific chilling incident. In the months before Martha's death, there was an event. One of the older daughters must have been about 14 then, Ruth, I think her name was, came to town with her mother. Some of the local boys, young men from good families, showed interest in her. Nothing improper, you understand, just young men noticing a pretty girl. Josiah heard about it somehow. He came to my store in a fury, a cold fury, which is the worst kind. He bought extra supplies, flour, salt, lead, and he announced he was building a wall. Not a literal wall, you see, but he made it clear his family would have no more contact with outsiders than absolutely necessary. That, Fisher said, his voice low, was the last time I ever saw Martha or any of the daughters in this town. Another longtime resident, a widow named Mrs. Clara Vogel, recalled meeting Martha Hargrove at a rare church service back in 1848, just before her complete disappearance from public life. She had that look, Mrs. Vogel said, her hands clasped in her lap. The look of a woman who has stopped fighting, who has accepted a fate she cannot change. When I tried to speak with her to offer some small comfort about the isolation she and her daughters faced, she just smiled. A sad, empty smile, and said, "We must submit to the authority God has placed over us." Those exact words, I've never forgotten them because they sounded so rehearsed, as if she had been taught exactly what to say, as if she were reciting a lesson. These accounts confirmed what Dr. Hayes had suspected. The isolation had been deliberate, progressive, and designed for one purpose: to cut the Hargrove daughters off from any possible outside contact or influence. By 1854, they had been living in near-complete seclusion for almost 5 years. Their entire world, their entire reality, had been reduced to their father and the 800 acres of land he controlled. As spring turned to summer, Hayes wrestled with the moral and practical implications of the situation. He had taken an oath to do no harm, but he had also witnessed what appeared to be ongoing, horrifying harm that he was powerless to stop. The law offered no remedy. The church, while sympathetic, had no jurisdiction over a family that didn't attend services. And the daughters themselves, however much they might suffer, were legally and practically unable to advocate for their own freedom. The situation might have remained in this terrible, macabre stalemate, a festering secret known only to a few, but in July of 1854, events took a dramatic and unavoidable turn. Two of the Hargrove daughters, Ruth and Naomi, the two eldest, went into labor within days of each other. The grim reality of their pregnancies could no longer be contained within the ranch's limestone walls. Josiah, left with no choice, sent Diego Fuentes to summon Dr. Hayes once again. But this time, the doctor arrived not just as a physician, but as an investigator, determined to do more than just provide medical care. He was determined to find the proof that Sheriff Prescott demanded. What he didn't know was that the proof he sought would be more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. The secrets kept in that house of shadows were about to be screamingly, agonizingly revealed. If you find yourself drawn into this dark, forgotten corner of history, and you want to support our mission to bring these forbidden stories to light, consider subscribing to Macabre Mysteries of America. What Dr. Hayes and his companion were about to witness would provide the crucial evidence needed to break this case, exposing a truth so disturbing it had been deliberately banned from the state's official histories for nearly a century. Dr. Hayes arrived at the Hargrove Ranch on July 18, 1854. This time, he was not alone. He was accompanied by a midwife named Elizabeth Chambers, a tough, no-nonsense widow with decades of experience whom he had insisted on bringing. Josiah had initially, and angrily, objected to the additional presence, but Hayes had been firm. The births of 2 children within days requires more than one pair of hands, Mr. Hargrove. Mrs. Chambers is discreet and professional. She comes or I do not. Reluctantly, Josiah had agreed. And so, Hayes and Chambers rode together to the isolated ranch, arriving in the suffocating heat of late afternoon. The limestone house seemed even more oppressive and forbidding than Hayes remembered. The windows were still shuttered. An unnatural, eerie quiet pervaded everything, a silence that felt heavier and more sinister than the summer air. Ruth was already in active labor when they arrived, her moans muffled by the thick stone walls. Naomi's contractions had begun that morning. Hayes and Chambers were shown to separate rooms where the two women lay, and the other sisters scurried about silently, fetching water and linens, their eyes always downcast, never meeting the visitors. Mrs. Chambers, an observant and intelligent woman, immediately noticed things that Hayes, as a male physician, might have missed. She saw the way the younger daughters moved around the house, silent, obedient like ghosts, never making eye contact with their father. She noted the crude iron locks on the outside of the upstairs bedroom doors. She observed that none of the daughters wore shoes, despite the rough stone floors, and realized this was a deliberate choice by Josiah. Makes it harder for them to run, she would later testify. The most damning evidence came during the births themselves. Ruth's labor was difficult, agonizing, lasting nearly 14 hours. During the worst of the pain, as women often do in extremis, she spoke without filter, her mind clouded by agony. She cried out for her mother, who had been dead for 5 years. She asked God why he had forsaken them. And then, in one moment of pure, undiluted agony, she screamed, "No more, Father. Please, no more." The words hung in the hot, still air like an accusation, a physical thing. Dr. Hayes, attending to Ruth, froze. He looked across the bed at Mrs. Chambers, and in that instant both of them understood the full, unadulterated horror of what they were witnessing. The formal term father could, perhaps, be interpreted as a desperate prayer to God. But in this context, with Ruth's terrified eyes fixed on the door where Josiah stood waiting, the meaning was unmistakable. This was not a prayer. It was a plea to the man who was the cause of her suffering, the man who had inflicted this upon her. The silence that followed her scream was broken only by her exhausted sobs. The forbidden secret of the Hargrove Ranch had finally been spoken aloud, and it was more macabre than anyone had dared to whisper. Naomi's birth, Hitch followed in the dark, early hours of the next morning, was easier physically, but in its own way more emotionally revealing. When the child was born, a small, frail daughter, Naomi wept, but it was not with joy. It was with a sound of pure, bottomless despair. "Another girl," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "He'll be disappointed. It's another girl." Mrs. Chambers, overcome with the moral urgency of the situation, did something unprecedented. She questioned Naomi directly, despite knowing Josiah was hovering just outside in the hallway. "Child, who is the father of this baby?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Naomi looked toward the door, toward the shadow of the man who stood listening. Her answer was careful, constructed, and utterly damning. "The father is the man who rules this house," she said, her eyes vacant. Then, summoning a final ounce of courage, she met Mrs. Chambers's eyes with a look of profound, heartbreaking sadness, and added, "I have known no other man." It was a statement that could be interpreted multiple ways, a desperate, coded message, designed to satisfy Josiah's demand for silence while still communicating the horrifying truth to those who had ears to hear. Hayes and Chambers both understood. These women had been so perfectly isolated for so long that they had literally never had the opportunity to know any other men. The implications were inescapable and monstrous. Before leaving the ranch, Dr. Hayes examined the 5 remaining pregnant daughters. All were progressing, ticking clocks moving toward their own inevitable deliveries in the coming months. He tried to speak privately with each, but Josiah hovered constantly, his presence a silent, suffocating threat that made any meaningful communication impossible. Yet even in their brief, fearful exchanges, Hayes gathered information. These young women had been systematically terrorized, controlled, and conditioned to accept their situation as normal, even inevitable. The ride back to Fredericksburg was conducted in a heavy, grim silence. Finally, Mrs. Chambers spoke, her voice trembling with rage. Dr. Hayes, in 40 years of attending births from the poorest slums to the richest homes, I have never seen anything like this. Those girls are prisoners, and what's being done to them? She couldn't finish the sentence. I know, Hayes said quietly. I've suspected since my first visit, but suspicion isn't proof, and even with what we heard, the law here is weak. Then we must make it strong, Chambers replied, her voice hardening. We must do something. Upon returning to Fredericksburg, Hayes and Chambers went directly to Sheriff Prescott and laid out everything they had witnessed, the locks, the fear, and the horrifying, damning words spoken during labor. The sheriff, a practical man, looked deeply uncomfortable but remained constrained by the legal realities. Legally, I can't do much, he said, rubbing his face. Those women would have to make formal complaints, and you've seen they're too frightened to do so. The father is within his legal rights to isolate his family on his property. As for the other matter, without testimony from the victims, it's their word against his, and he is the legal head of household. And what of their rights, Sheriff? Mrs. Chambers' eyes blazed with anger. What of their basic humanity? Prescott looked uncomfortable but stood his ground. Ma'am, I don't disagree with your sentiment, but I'm an officer of the law, not a philosopher. I enforce the laws as written, not as I might wish them to be. The conversation reached a frustrating, hopeless impasse, but Hayes, now joined by the formidable Mrs. Chambers, refused to give up. He spent the following days consulting with every authority figure he could find, ministers, merchants, even the few circuit-riding lawyers practicing in the region. The response was uniformly sympathetic but unhelpful. Everyone agreed the situation was a disturbing horror, but no one could identify a clear legal path to intervention. Then, in early August, an unexpected ally emerged. A young, ambitious attorney named Benjamin Yates had recently arrived in Fredericksburg from Austin, where he had been studying under one of Texas's few progressive legal scholars. Yates had heard the dark rumors of the Hargrove case, and he approached Dr. Hayes with a radical idea. The law, as currently written, may not protect those women, Yates explained, his eyes bright with intellectual fervor. But there's a principle in common law called parens patriae, the state's right, its duty, to intervene on behalf of those who cannot protect themselves. It's rarely invoked, especially in Texas, but there is precedent. If we could convince a judge that those women are being held against their will in conditions that constitute imprisonment, we might be able to obtain a writ of habeas corpus. It was a legal long shot, a desperate gambit that required a almost revolutionary, legal interpretation and a sympathetic judge. But it was something. It was a potential avenue where before there had been only a solid brick wall of patriarchal law. Yates, working through the night, drafted a petition. Dr. Hayes and Mrs. Chambers signed detailed affidavits, describing everything they had seen and heard, including the chilling utterances during Ruth's and Naomi's labors. The documents were presented to Judge Thomas Carrion, the circuit judge who rode through the region hearing cases. Judge Carrion was an older man, conservative in temperament, but known for his fierce independence and his intolerance for frontier brutality. He read the petition carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. He asked Hayes and Chambers pointed, specific questions, and then, to everyone's astonishment, he agreed to issue a preliminary order. I will not issue a full writ of habeas corpus without more information, the judge said, his voice grave. But I will authorize Sheriff Prescott to conduct a formal welfare check on the Hargrove daughters, and I will authorize Attorney Yates to accompany him, to ensure these daughters, who are citizens of Texas, understand their full legal rights, including the right to be free from imprisonment. It was more than Hayes had dared hope for. On August 15, 1854, Sheriff Prescott, Attorney Yates, Dr. Hayes, and Mrs. Chambers rode out to the Hargrove Ranch, armed with a judge's order and a grim determination to finally break through the wall of silence that had protected Josiah Hargrove's macabre, forbidden kingdom for so long. Hargrove Ranch appeared different when the official party arrived on that hot August afternoon. For the first time in Dr. Hayes's experience, the shutters stood open. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the summer heat. As they dismounted, Josiah emerged onto the porch. His demeanor had changed dramatically from Hayes's previous visits. There was no anger, no suspicion. Instead, he seemed calm, almost welcoming. "Sheriff Prescott," Josiah said, his voice even. "I had a feeling you'd come eventually." Dr. Hayes couldn't keep his suspicions to himself, could he? There was no anger in his tone, only a strange, unsettling resignation that put everyone immediately on edge. Sheriff Prescott, all business, unfolded Judge Carrion's order and read it aloud. Authorization to enter the premises to speak with the daughters privately and to ensure they were not being held against their will. Josiah listened without interruption, his hands clasped behind his back. Then he simply stepped aside. "Of course, Sheriff. I have nothing to hide from the law or from God. My daughters are in the main room. You will find them, prepared to speak with you." The phrasing was odd, and as the group entered the house, they understood why. All 7 daughters sat in a perfect, rigid row on wooden benches in the main living area. Ruth and Naomi each held their newborn infants. The other 5, all visibly pregnant at various stages, sat with their hands folded in their laps, their eyes fixed on the floor. They wore matching, simple gray dresses, and their hair was braided identically. They looked less like individuals than like a collection of similar, broken dolls, arranged for display. Sheriff Prescott, clearly unnerved by the macabre tableau, cleared his throat. "Ladies, my name is Sheriff Prescott. I need to speak with each of you individually. Judge Carrion has authorized me to ensure you are here of your own free will and that you understand your legal rights as citizens." Utter silence greeted his announcement. Not one daughter looked up. "Ruth Hargrove," Prescott said, addressing the eldest. "As the firstborn, I'll start with you. Would you come speak with me and Mr. Yates privately?" Ruth slowly stood, her newborn daughter cradled in her arms. She glanced once fleetingly at Josiah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. She then followed Prescott and Attorney Yates into an adjacent room, closing the door behind them. Dr. Hayes and Mrs. Chambers remained in the main room with the other 6 daughters and Josiah, who stood by the fireplace, watching. It was an uncomfortable, agonizing tableau of watchful waiting. The interview with Ruth lasted nearly 30 minutes. When she emerged, her face was composed but deathly pale, and she would not meet anyone's eyes. As she returned to her seat, Prescott's expression revealed nothing, but Attorney Yates looked deeply, visibly troubled. One by one, each daughter was interviewed. Naomi, then Judith, then Esther, Deborah, Mary, and finally, 15-year-old Sarah. Each interview lasted between 20 and 40 minutes. Each daughter emerged looking pale and shaken, but maintaining the same careful, rehearsed composure. During these long, agonizing interviews, an extraordinary, suffocating tension filled the main room. Mrs. Chambers, sitting near the younger daughters as they waited their turn, attempted to make quiet, gentle conversation. She asked simple, innocuous questions about their daily routines, their health, whether they needed anything. But every attempt at conversation was met with monosyllables or complete silence. She noticed that before answering even the most simple question, "Is the baby sleeping well?" each daughter's eyes would flick nervously toward Josiah, as if seeking permission to speak. He had broken them. He had conditioned them so completely that even in his silence, his control was absolute. Finally, after more than 4 grueling hours, all the interviews were concluded. Sheriff Prescott gathered his small group on the porch outside, out of earshot of the house. He delivered his findings with visible, profound frustration. "Every single one of them tells the same story," he said, his voice low and angry. "They claim they're here voluntarily, that they're being well cared for, and that the pregnancies," he spat the word, "resulted from relationships with traveling workers. Different men, they claim, who have since moved on. They refuse to name these men or provide any details that could be verified." "It's obviously rehearsed," Attorney Yates interjected, pacing the porch. "They've been coached. The answers were too similar, too carefully constructed to avoid any specific, verifiable claims." "I know that," Prescott snapped, then took a breath to compose himself. "But coached or not, they've all stated clearly to me, an officer of the law, that they're here by choice and that they wish to remain. From a legal standpoint, my hands are tied. They are adults, or near enough, and they have all denied being imprisoned or abused." "Did you ask them directly?" Mrs. Chambers demanded, her hands clenched into fists. "Did you ask if their father is the one who made them pregnant?" Prescott's face darkened. "I did. Each one denied it. Some became visibly distressed at the question, tears, shaking. But all of them denied it, firmly. Without their testimony, there was no case. The law was once again powerless." Dr. Hayes felt a cold despair settling over him like a heavy cloak. They had come so far, obtained a judge's approval, brought the full, albeit meager, weight of the law to this isolated frontier, and still the wall of silence held. The daughters were too frightened, too conditioned, or perhaps too terrifyingly aware of their lack of any other options to break free. But Attorney Yates wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Sheriff," he said, his voice quiet but intense, "I'd like to speak with the youngest, Sarah, one more time, alone, without her father anywhere nearby." "Judge Carrion's order gives us that authority." Prescott looked doubtful but shrugged. "Won't hurt to try, I suppose, though I don't know what you expect to accomplish." They returned to the house, and Yates made his request, to speak with Sarah once more, this time on the far side of the porch, away from her father and sisters. Josiah's icy composure finally cracked just slightly. "You've already spoken with her. This borders on harassment, attorney." "Yet the order gives me the authority," Yates replied calmly. "Sarah, would you please step outside with me?" The 15-year-old girl stood slowly, and as she moved toward the door, something extraordinary happened. Ruth, the eldest sister, spoke for the first time since her interview, her voice sharp. "Sarah, remember what you're taught. Remember where your loyalty lies." It was meant to sound like sisterly advice, but the words had the cold, sharp quality of a threat, or perhaps a desperate warning. Sarah nodded slowly, her face pale, and followed Attorney Yates onto the porch. What transpired in the conversation that followed would later be described by Yates in his court testimony as the most heartbreaking and courageous act I have ever witnessed. At first, Sarah, trembling, repeated the same rehearsed story she had told the sheriff. She was there voluntarily. The father of her child was a traveling worker. She wished to stay with her family. But Yates, drawing on the insights he had gained from speaking with the other sisters, tried a different, desperate approach. "Sarah," he said gently, "I'm not asking you to tell me what happened. I am asking you, what do you want to happen if you could choose any future, any life? What would it be?" The question, so simple and so impossible, seemed to penetrate through the years of conditioning. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, which began to stream silently down her face. "That's a cruel question, sir," she whispered. "What I want doesn't matter. It has never mattered." "It matters to me," Yates insisted. "It matters to the law. You are a citizen of Texas, Sarah, young as you are. You have rights." "Rights?" She let out a short, bitter laugh, a sound no 15-year-old should ever make. "I have the right to obey. I have the right to accept. I have the right to survive. Those are the only rights that matter here." "What if there was somewhere else?" Yates pressed, leaning in. "What if I could promise you safety, shelter, a life where you could make your own choices?" For a long moment Sarah stared at him, a terrible war visible in her expression. Hope fought with fear, desperation fought with resignation. Finally, in a voice barely audible, she said, "Could you promise the same for my sisters, all of them?" "I can try," Yates said honestly. "But I need your help. I need you to tell the truth." Sarah looked back through the open window at the room where her father and sisters waited. Her hands moved unconsciously to her pregnant belly, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady despite her tears. "The truth won't set us free, sir," she said. "The truth will destroy us. We have nowhere to go, no skills, no money. We would be ruined, marked as shameful. Society. They would see us as accomplices, not victims. Our father knows this. He's told us over and over. The world outside is cruel to women like us. Our only choice is to endure and to survive in the only way available to us." "But," Yates began. "No," Sarah interrupted, and now a core of steel entered her voice. "I will tell you what you want to know, but only if you promise to help all of us, not just me. I won't be saved alone. Either we all leave or none of us do." It was an ultimatum that changed everything. Yates, having no idea how he could possibly fulfill such a promise, agreed immediately. And then in halting, tearful, horrifying sentences, 15-year-old Sarah Hargrove told him the truth. She told him about life on the isolated ranch, about the progressive, suffocating isolation after their mother's death. She told him about the night, several months ago, when their father's protection had turned into something monstrous. She told him about the terrible, silent understanding that had settled over all the sisters as, one by one, they realized their fate. They were trapped in a macabre, living nightmare with no visible escape. When the conversation ended, Sarah was sobbing quietly, her small frame shaking. Yates, his face a mask of cold fury, walked back into the house. He walked past Josiah, who was watching him with narrowed eyes. He walked past the row of silent, waiting sisters. And he walked directly to Sheriff Prescott. "We need to arrest him now," he said quietly, his voice shaking with rage. "I have testimony." The arrest of Josiah Hargrove on August 15, 1854, was conducted without violence but with a palpable electric tension. Sheriff Prescott, now armed with Sarah's testimony and supported by the authority of Judge Carrion's order, placed Josiah in restraints while the daughters watched in a state of shocked, terrified silence. Their world, so brutal and so predictable, had just been shattered. Josiah Hargrove himself seemed almost relieved. It was a curious, deeply disturbing response that Dr. Hayes noted in his journal. He smiled when the shackles were locked, Hayes wrote, as if he had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it. As the sheriff led Josiah toward his horse, the patriarch turned back to face his daughters one final time. His words, spoken calmly and with a disturbing, prophetic certainty, would haunt those present for years to come. "You'll see," he said, his cold eyes moving from one daughter to the next. "The world will not embrace you as you think. They will judge you more harshly than they judge me. I protected you from that judgment. Now, you'll face it alone." The trial, held in October 1854, was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony from Sarah, Ruth, and Naomi consistent and heartbreaking. Josiah's defense was, in itself, a confession. He claimed he loved his daughters and was protecting them from a corrupt world, exercising his biblical authority. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Carrion sentenced him to 20 years at hard labor, one of the harshest sentences of the era. Josiah was transported to the Huntsville State Prison, where records show he served 13 years before dying of pneumonia in 1867, unmourned and unvisited. But the resolution of Josiah's fate did little to resolve the fate of his daughters. They now faced the very world he had warned them about, and his horrifying prophecy proved partially true. The months following the conviction were perhaps the most challenging. The sisters were free, but utterly unprepared for freedom. Mrs. Chambers became their primary advocate, organizing a small network of church women to help them through their remaining pregnancies. Between August and December 1854, 5 more babies were born. In total, the 7 women gave birth to 9 children. The stigma attached to them was severe. Charitable organizations declined to help, citing the scandalous nature of the case. The community was torn, whispering that the girls tainted by the crime must have somehow encouraged it. They were victims, yet they were treated like pariahs. They were paralyzed by their newfound freedom. Dr. Hayes described visiting the ranch and finding Mary, the 17-year-old, standing in the dark, unable to light a candle because Father always said to conserve them. When Mrs. Chambers told her, "You are free to make that choice now," Mary simply wept, whispering, I don't know how to choose." The resolution, when it came, was imperfect, but it was, at least, a form of survival. Father Brandt and the Lutheran congregation purchased a small, new farmstead 10 miles from Fredericksburg, placing it in trust for the sisters. Dr. Hayes and Mrs. Chambers taught them practical skills, midwifery, sewing, reading, and mathematics, allowing them to support themselves. Remarkably, 2 of the sisters eventually married. In 1857, Ruth married a kind widower, and in 1859, Esther married a local ranch hand. The other 5 sisters never married. Instead, they created a new life, a new kind of family on their small farm, raising their 9 children collectively, supporting themselves, and finding a measure of peace. They outlasted their father by decades. The last surviving Hargrove sister, Sarah, the youngest, the one whose courage had broken the silence at age 15, died in 1918 at the age of 84. In her later years, she became a quiet, forceful advocate for women's rights, speaking at church gatherings about the vital importance of education and independence for women. She never discussed her own horrifying experiences publicly, but those who knew her story understood the profound weight behind her words when she said, "A woman must never be so isolated that she cannot seek help. A woman must never be so dependent that she cannot leave." The Hargrove case remains one of the most disturbing, macabre, and forbidden cold cases in Texas history. It is a chilling reminder of how isolation and unchecked authority can create a living nightmare. What do you think of this story? Does it make you reflect on how much, or how little, has changed in protecting the vulnerable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this historical account moved you, please share this video. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to see more forgotten histories that deserve to be remembered.